Para makashare siya ng opinion.
Dun sa Zoom? Sa participants, okay. And then, may co-host, okay.
Oo.
Ayan, sorry, hindi ko na ano. Okay.
Ayan. There you go. So, Mico?
Yes, sir. Okay. So again, good morning, ma'am, sirs. Thank you very much for this opportunity. The title of my presentation is The Security Pursuits of a Small State, a comparative study of the Philippines' security partnerships with Australia, Japan, and Vietnam 2010 to 2016. So now, shown on the screen is the outline of my presentation. After a brief introduction and an overview of the RRL and methodology, I shall proceed with the data presentation chapters, data presentation and analysis chapters, and thereafter the key findings and recommendations. So in his seminal work, Theory of International Politics, Kenneth Waltz pointed out that states, in response to security challenges, pursue two major courses of action. One is internal balancing, which refers to the enhancement of military and economic capabilities. And the other is external balancing, which refers to the pursuit of alliances. However, security cooperation between and among states is not limited to alliances. There are other forms, such as security communities, you have coalitions, and then we have strategic partnership, which is a relatively new concept in the field of IR. And as was pointed out earlier, much of the works on this realm has focused on the strategic partnerships of major powers. Little attention has been given to the pursuit of strategic partnerships by small powers. So it is in this context that this study is situated. With that in mind, the main research problem is, under what conditions do small states undertake strategic partnerships with other states? Specifically, how does the Philippines, under the Aquino III administration, perceive its strategic challenges as a small power? What are the factors that influence the Philippines in selecting potential strategic partners? And what are the factors that determine the choice of states to forge specific partnership types? Now, the research objectives are as follows: to increase understanding on the strategic behavior of a small state, to contribute to the strategic partnership academic literature, to provide possible policy inputs to the defense and security establishment of the Philippines, and to provide historical analysis of the foreign and security policies of the Aquino government. The scope of this presentation is the Aquino administration 2010 to 2016, focusing only on the security dimensions of the strategic partnerships. It does not cover in-depth relations with international organizations, although references will be made with respect to ASEAN as well as the Philippines-US alliance. And it is not a purely diplomatic history, but rather an analysis of the conditions that led to the pursuit of strategic partnerships by the Philippines. Now, the study is significant because, as I've mentioned, it is a strategic partnership is a relatively new concept in the field of IR, and examining the concept using the Philippine case might offer some modest conceptual clarification. The topic is still very much relevant in the sense that security partnership agreements are still in effect, and also beyond that, it offers potential significance because by examining these conditions, it might point out to the underlying diplomatic imperatives of why the Philippines need to pursue security relations with other states. So the theory of that I adopted for this paper is essentially an amalgamation of the theory of small state behavior by Michael McCammett with that of the strategic partnership framework of a strategic partnership framework of Thomas Wilkins. Now, in his theory of small state behavior, Mr. McCammett pointed out that a small state's behavior guided by 4 key characteristics. One is limited capabilities, tendency to support the current international order, working within the framework of international law and organizations, and tendency to have high levels of paranoia, meaning viewing international relations as an activity that brings more risks rather than opportunities. And cognizant of that context, small states forge a strategic partnership with another state because of the uncertainty of the international environment and what Wilkins called strategic fit, which is essentially the convergence of strategic interests between two states. And strategic partnership evolves in three phases of formation, implementation, and evaluation. The evaluation portion is not part of this current study. Now, just a brief overview of the RRL. There's no single definition of what small state or small power, which is used interchangeably throughout the literature. And the common theme, nonetheless, is its relative weakness vis-a-vis the other states or other powers in the region. Now, there are different forms of security cooperation. Alliance is more of a legally binding type of arrangement founded in a bilateral treaty. Coalitions are more of ad hoc arrangement, security community, which is underpinned by a common identity, such as the EU, and then you have strategic partnership, which is relatively less formal and low commitment cost, and essentially a structured collaboration between states or other actors in order to take advantage of economic opportunities or address security challenges. Now, the different schools of thought of IR have different perspectives on strategic partnership. Realists would argue that it is basically driven by shared security concerns. The liberal institutionalists would argue that strategic partnership is formed after a period of cooperation on functional areas or those less controversial areas. Constructivists, on the other hand, that this is driven by the need to promote norms and values. And as I pointed out earlier, much of the literature has thus far focused on major powers. So briefly on the methodology and research design, I used a qualitative methodology and most different comparative case study design. Because the three cases all resulted to security partnerships, the methods of data collection, I reviewed primarily the strategic partnership declarations of the three countries, related defense and security agreements, press releases, news articles, journal articles, and so on. And I also conducted key informant interviews. And I was fortunate enough to be granted an audience with the former Secretary of National Defense, Lieutenant General Voltaire Gasmin, the former Chief of Staff of the AFP, General Emmanuel Bautista, and officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs and the National Security Council. Now, when the Aquino administration came to power in 2010, it identified major power competition, particularly between the United States and China, as one of the key challenges facing the Philippines. And the South China Sea was viewed from that context, which is essentially as an area of competition between the United States and China. And China essentially nearly claims the entire South China Sea with its expansive 9-dash line claim. Now, that body of water and arguably the greater or broader Western Pacific has been the region in which the United States has exercised geopolitical preeminence since the end of World War II. From the perspective of the Philippines, China's excessive claims significantly overlaps with its own maritime and territorial claims. Now, major power competition and South China Sea dispute amplified the Philippines' sense of vulnerability as a small power in four ways. First, it definitely underscored its limited capabilities as a small power, particularly during the Scarborough Shoal dispute. Second, the Philippines became more vocal in expressing its support for U.S. presence. It supported President Obama's rebalance to Asia. And in 2014, the country signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement with Washington in order to facilitate the rebalance. Third, the administration also utilized international law and organizations. We filed an arbitration case against China in 2013. We tried to persuade ASEAN to adopt certain initiatives to manage the South China Sea dispute, such as the transformation of the South China Sea into a zone of peace, freedom, friendship, and cooperation, and as well as the Triple Action Plan. And also asked ASEAN to issue stronger statements on the South China Sea. And in 2012, because of this issue, for the first time in its history, the ASEAN foreign ministers failed to issue a joint communique. And it was also during this period that the Philippines appeared to became more paranoid with its security, particularly in two ways. One, because of what was happening in the South China Sea dispute, the Philippine Congress enacted a revised AFP modernization law the same year the Scarborough Shoal incident happened, and this essentially extended the original AFP modernization program for another 15 years. And although the defense budget increased, some equipment and assets were acquired, it is highly unlikely that these initiatives would have made immediate significant impact on the dynamics in the South China Sea. And therefore, the Philippines, under the Aquino administration, asked the United States to give clear-cut security guarantees that it would come to its aid in the event of an armed conflict. However, by the time the administration left office in 2016, no such security guarantees were given. Now, what I tried to do in this paper is to compare the three partnership agreements on three fronts: the principles and interests articulated, the areas of cooperation, and the mechanisms for implementation. I tried to compare them within the context of the Philippines' vulnerabilities as a small power, in order to understand the underlying themes that the Philippines, as a small power, has in understanding the conditions that led to the strategic partnerships. So now, when the government, the Aquino administration came in 2010, it issued the NSP, National Security Policy, the following year, which provided a guidance for the government to pursue strategic partnerships. And although there was no Aquino era publicly released document or pronouncement that explains in great detail of what a strategic partnership is, there are nevertheless some elements on how the administration viewed a strategic partnership is. First, it viewed it as a form of security cooperation, something short of a formal military alliance. Second, it is informal in the sense that it is established through joint declarations among leaders or ministers. And third, there is no legal commitment to defend each other in the event of an armed conflict. Now, whether or not they will come to each other's aid in the event of an armed aggression remains an open question. Nonetheless, the strategic partnership becomes the overall framework of bilateral cooperation. So there appears to be certain parameters that the Philippines has undertook in order to determine strategic partners. One is if there is a convergence of interest, which is what Wilkins calls strategic fit, and geographic location. As Secretary Gazmin emphasized in my interview, he noted that the Philippines chose partners that are likewise in the similar geopolitical environment. So you have Japan, Vietnam, and Australia. So reviewing these documents, the declarations, in light of the Philippines' vulnerabilities, I think a careful examination would point out there are three underlying themes that would point out why the Philippines, or the conditions rather, of why the Philippines forged strategic partnerships with other states. So first, the imperative to support the current international order. Second is the necessity to promote capacity building efforts. And lastly, the need to support and enhance existing multilateral architecture. So with those three themes in mind, now please allow me now to discuss the three cases. So the 2011-2015 Strategic Partnership Declarations enhanced Philippines-Japan security relations. Now these declarations, as well as other policy documents and pronouncements from both Manila and Tokyo, emphasize the need to support the current international order. For the Philippines, such order is being undermined by an increasingly assertive China, particularly with its actions in the South China Sea, and Japan expressed a similar concern. Now, China's actions in the South China Sea must be viewed from a broader context. In 1982, China's Navy unveiled its vision of dominating the Western Pacific by exercising preeminence in the first and second island chain. Now, incidentally, the Philippines and Japan are part of that first island chain. And from Japan's perspective, if China successfully dominates the South China Sea, it would have the capability to strangle Japan's economy and affect its security, because it is heavily reliant on sea lanes of communications as a maritime and archipelagic country like the Philippines. And so therefore, Japan and the Philippines underscore the need to ensure freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea, or in Tokyo's parlance, the so-called open and stable seas. And in the same vein, the two countries also reaffirmed their support for US-led system of alliances and partnerships, of which they are part. Now, the second condition essentially is an operationalization of the first one, the promotion of capacity building efforts. Japan provided the Philippines with 10 multi-role response vessels for our Coast Guard. It provided training aircraft for our Navy, and initiated training activities and exercises under the Memorandum of Understanding on Defense Cooperation. And since 2012, Japan has been a regular participant of the Philippines-US Balikatan exercises as an observer. Now, the third condition is supporting and enhancing existing multilateral architecture, particularly the ASEAN-led platforms. Now, ASEAN at present is at the center of this multilateral architecture, but this is in no small part due to the tacit license provided by the major powers, as other scholars have argued. This is essentially a default position because of the lack of strategic trust among the major powers. Nonetheless, since ASEAN does occupy that central role, Japan and the Philippines, which is a founding member of ASEAN, expressed its support for ASEAN and its and ASEAN-led platforms such as the ADMM or the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, ASEAN Regional Forum, and the East Asia Summit. Now, amidst the heightened tensions in the South China Sea, the Philippines and Vietnam witnessed a rapid development of their diplomatic and security cooperation with the issuance of the 2015 Strategic Partnership Declaration. And like Japan, Vietnam has likewise expressed its concern over the increasing strategic competition, likewise viewed the South China Sea as an area of such competition. And since Vietnam and the Philippines are actually have overlapping claims in the South China Sea. And however, in view of China's assertiveness, it appears that that differences has been put on the back burner. And unlike Japan and the Philippines, Vietnam is arguably more of a tacit supporter of the current US-led order, in the sense that it has not expressed in the similar manner that the Philippines and Japan has, but at the same time also not criticized the United States. And in fact, they have a comprehensive partnership since 2013, and 2016 marked a major turning point with the United States lifting its armed embargo against Vietnam. Now, the capacity building component of the strategic partnership with Vietnam has yet to reach a similar level compared to that of the Philippines and Japan. Nonetheless, Vietnam has provided the Philippines with information on China on China's tactics in the South China Sea, and they've likewise conducted naval interaction activities in the South China Sea as confidence-building measures. And like Japan, Vietnam has likewise participated in the Philippines-US Balikatan exercises as an observer. And being fellow ASEAN members, the two countries likewise expressed support for ASEAN centrality. And indeed, the two countries helped each other in persuading ASEAN in issuing stronger statements on the South China Sea. Now, the Philippines-Australia Comprehensive Partnership was established in 2015, founded on a long history of relationship between the two countries. And like Japan, the Philippines and Vietnam has also expressed concern over the increasing competition between the United States and China. Australia has been consistent, at least during the Aquino administration, in underscoring that regional stability is underpinned by continued U.S. presence in the region. And as such, also reaffirms support for the US-led system of alliances. They likewise viewed the South China Sea as an area of competition, and as such, reaffirmed the need for freedom of navigation over flight in the region. Now, capacity building efforts between the two countries are more institutionalized, since we have a status of visiting forces agreement with Australia, which came into effect in 2012, and Australia has provided us with 2 landing craft heavy vessels, of which the Philippines ordered 3 more units, and Australia, because we have an existing soft vow with them, has participated in the Philippines-US Balikatan exercises as an actual participant and not as an observer like the other 2 partners. And Australia has likewise expressed support for enhancing existing ASEAN-led platforms. So the viewing how the administration or the Aquino administration viewed a strategic partnership, it could very well be argued that the Australia-Philippines Comprehensive Partnership is a strategic partnership in all but name. And the decision of why there was a change in the nomenclature, it was a result of the negotiations of both countries, but nonetheless, on the substantive aspects, more of it were the same. But it could be surmised that the change was largely due to the context in which this was established. It was in 2015, shortly before the outcome of the arbitral ruling. So it appears that Australia did not want to complicate its relations with China at the time, but nonetheless established this platform of cooperation with the Philippines that, as I've said, substantially conforms with the other two partnerships. So in moving forward, there are, I think, two key challenges here. One is sustaining the momentum. If at any, the strategic competition between the United States and China has continued to intensify, even in the midst of today's COVID-19 pandemic. So the strategic environment of during the Aquino administration has in many ways has continued, but as I've said, it's just intensified. So there's a need really to sustain the momentum of cooperation with the three countries. And second is addressing gray zone coercion challenges. These are actions below the threshold of armed conflict. China has utilized this in order to slowly alter the status quo. It is essentially the tactic that was used in grabbing Scarborough Shoal from us and the establishment of the artificial islands and so on. So the findings, the context in which the Philippines pursued strategic partnership underscores a strategic behavior as a small state. Now, for the Philippines, a strategic partnership is part of an overall strategy for small state survival. And strategic partnerships are suitable for the current geostrategic environment because, as I pointed out, the strategic environment in which we live in today is not the same as the USSR Cold War strategic competition, in the sense that during the Cold War, it was relatively easier for states to pick sides. Now, it is not. China is very much integrated into the global economy which is very different from how the Soviet Union behaved during the Cold War. Now, as I mentioned, it is suitable in the sense, because as I've mentioned, a key feature of a strategic partnership, it is less informal and a bit more flexible compared to a rigid alliance. So in that sense, it is more suitable, and there are low commitment costs in the sense that the abandonment and entrapment dynamics that is faced in a traditional form of an alliance is not present here. And so strategic partnerships of the Philippines develop differently, and just a footnote, it is noticeable that the Philippines-Vietnam relations was elevated into a strategic partnership despite not having that long history of relations, at least when compared to the Philippines-Japan and arguably the Philippines-Australia relations as well. So it's notes on the recommendations on directions for future research. So on strategic partnerships, perhaps there could be further study on the relationship of between strategic partnerships among themselves, as well as with other security arrangements. Like, for example, the relationship of the Japan-Philippines strategic partnership with that of the Philippines-US alliance and the broader system of US-led alliances and partnerships. And perhaps studies on the evaluation dimension of the strategic partnership and the impact, perhaps, of domestic political factors in the establishment of strategic partnership and its confluence with systemic factors. On small powers, perhaps studies on the strategy of small state survival in today's era of strategic competition. On Philippine strategic studies, perhaps the impact of President Duterte's so-called pivot to China on the three partnerships that I have earlier discussed, and the challenges of promoting national interest in multilateral platforms. So on policy recommendations, I mentioned earlier, there's an imperative to sustain the strategic partnerships and consideration of the SOFVA. I know this is a controversial topic at this time because of the developments of the Philippines-US VFA, but nonetheless, I think if conditions are better, I think VFA with Japan and Vietnam are still worth considering, because this would provide a firmer legal framework for the presence of Vietnamese and Japanese forces in the country, in the similar way that American and Australian forces have legal status here in the country. And lastly, as I've mentioned, confronting gray zone coercion challenges. As I mentioned, it is being used by China in altering the status quo in the region. So with that, thank you very much, ma'am, sirs, for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Mico, both for giving us a succinct summary of your paper and for actually keeping to the time, largely keeping to the time. So with that, can I now proceed to comments from the panel? Professor Tana, can we start with you?
Okay, thank you, Mico, and congratulations for making it this far.
Thank you.
So my critique of the thesis focuses on the following. So first point, the thesis is not able to sufficiently address the criticisms against strategic partnerships.
Sandali lang ha. I'm sorry. Nawala si Professor Bolinaw, Aris. Should we wait for her to come back before we proceed, or do we continue as is? I think nag-ano ulit yung kanyang yung wifi niya eh.
Siguro po hintay lang tayo ng
sige. Let's just wait for her first.
Para lang baka yung mga tanong niya itatanong na ni Tay.
Oo nga. Ayan.
Yeah, pwede ka na mag-start.
Lu, okay ka na? Naka-mute ka pero okay ka na? Okay, sige. I'm asking si Professor Tana to proceed with her comments. Hindi ko alam kung saan ka na, at what point doon sa presentation ni Mico ikaw nawala. Hindi ko napansin kagad kung ano. But he finished his presentation and I'm already asking the members of the panel. Is that okay? Or would you like Mico to repeat yung last niya? Yung last slide niya?
Sa recommendations. Nakita ko yun.
Sige. So okay na tayo. Sige. Kung ganon, Professor Tana, please.
Okay, so first point. So the thesis, I think, is not able to sufficiently address the criticisms against strategic partnerships, specifically that it is just a mere political label, and that what constitutes strategic in these partnerships remain vague. Okay, so it's the first point. Second, it is also not clear what the thesis is arguing about and what variables are being studied. So the questions posed on page 15 seem to seek only descriptive answers, like, under what conditions do small states undertake strategic partnerships, and then what are the factors that influence the Philippines, what are the factors that determine the choices to forge specific strategic partnerships. So remember that the thesis has to explain something and not just to describe or not just to enumerate reasons. So this brings us to another set of questions: that what is the problem? Why is it a problem? And to whom it is a problem? Okay, the third point concerns your theory, your theoretical framework. So I'm not entirely convinced with the theory that is selected. So what is this theory of small states by Michael McCamiet? So is it an established theory? Are there other scholarly works that employ this theory? What are the limitations or weaknesses of this theory? And that given the weaknesses, why do you still choose to use it? Okay, and then related to that, you also said on page 20 that the study is situated in the realist understanding of small state behavior. So my question then is, why not use a variant of realism instead to explain the research problem? Michael McCamiet himself used neoclassical realism in one or two of his own works, so why not use NCR too? Or if not NCR, there are other theories that could also explain the behavior of small states. By the way, can we use the term small states and small powers interchangeably? I think this is also not fully explored in the paper. Okay, so as I was saying, there are other theories that could explain the behavior of small states. For example, Muhammad Ayub's subaltern realism, or you could also use role theory or other foreign policy analysis approaches or constructivist IR approaches. So there's also an article by Victor Biglu, for example, that explains small states foreign policy through role theory. So I guess my point is your justification for your theory choice is weak. Okay, on page 60 onwards, you briefly discussed liberal institutionalism and constructivism, but your explanation on why you did not use them seems to be lacking. So perhaps you should not be too quick to dismiss them. Okay, and then also concerning the theory, you also used Wilkins' paradigm on strategic partnerships. So how exactly does this complement McCammy's theory of small states. So in your presentation earlier, we were able to discuss it, but in the original manuscript that you submitted, I think this is not clearly articulated. So the link between these two frameworks must be firmly established. Also, my impression is that these two frameworks, Wilkins and McCammy's, they are quite descriptive. So McCammy's shows how small states behave, and then Wilkins shows how strategic partnerships are formed. So how do they exactly provide a framework for analysis? So on page 26, you have a conceptual diagram, but it does not reflect the assumptions of the theories or theory, and does not illustrate the relationship among the variables. What are the study's variables anyway? So what are the independent variables? What's dependent variables? Are there any intervening variables? Okay. And then for the review of related lit, there should be a separate section on the gaps in contributions. So how exactly does the thesis hope to fill the gaps in the existing literature, and what are the study's theoretical and empirical contributions? So in your presentation, you summarize the findings, but I think there's really nothing novel about these findings. So you have to offer something new using the theory that you've chosen, if you still want to stick with it. Okay. So how exactly does the thesis hope to fill the gaps in the existing literature? What are the study's theoretical contributions? And I think I mentioned this already. I also suggest that you make a table that summarizes the main themes and which major works fall under such themes. Make it just more organized for us to see clearly, like, this is how strategic partnerships are positioned in the extant literature, and these are the major works that deal with this topic. Then you can see what are the gaps. And then for the organization, so I suggested the data chapters to be organized based on the case studies. So for example, chapter 3 should be about Philippines and Japan, 4 Philippines, Australia, and then 5 the Philippines, Vietnam, for the readers to get a more nuanced understanding of the comparisons. But I guess this is entirely up to you and your supervisor, and if you still have time to revise it. And then, yeah, I guess the last, finally, my final comment. The rest are in the document, right? So small comments. So these are just the major ones. The findings should also reflect the assumptions of the theory. Like, so the findings, how does the theory explain these findings? And not just describe, you have to really analyze. So those are the major ones.
Thank you, Professor Tana. Professor Bolinao, can I invite you to give us your thoughts on the thesis?
All right. Thank you. Yung sa akin naman, I approached yung study as a non-political scientist, of course. So this is all very interesting to me. Okay, although tama yung sinabi ng ni Dr. Tana na parang descriptive siya. So that was also the sense that I got when I read the thesis. It was very descriptive, pero wala talaga siyang pinupunto. I mean, these are the same things that can be found doon sa annexes na yun din ang nakalagay, pero parang nilabas lang niya tapos nilagay sa thesis. Okay, so hindi ko alam kung yun ay tatakaran sa pol-sci, okay, pero ganun din yung dating sa akin ng Okay, these are some of the questions I have. These are more born of curiosity, okay, as a non-political scientist. Pero my first question is, what is in it for the larger states? Nakita ko yung advantage for the smaller state na papasok sila sa ganitong uri ng partnership, pero hindi ko nakikita kung ano yung advantage nito. Bakit pumapayag yung larger state na pumasok sa ganitong partnership? I don't think it was explained. I didn't find it. And I'm so curious to see kung ano yung rationale behind entering in a larger state, entering into this kind of partnership. Okay, so that's one. Tapos yung pangalawa, I'm very curious kung bakit may hiwalay ng strategic partnership with Vietnam and with ASEAN. Okay, so ano ba yung ASEAN? Hindi rin na ipaliwanag to, medyo nebulous sa akin yung ano ba yung core mission at saka principles ng ASEAN at bakit kailangan gumawa ng hiwalay na partnership with Vietnam. Okay, so ito ba ay dahil lang meron silang common claim sa South China Sea. Pero ganun din naman ang Malaysia at saka Indonesia. Pero wala tayong such strategic partnership with them. So hindi malinaw sa akin itong hindi na ipalabas doon sa thesis kung bakit we have one with Vietnam and not with other countries na may claim din sa South China Sea. At bakit hindi ito covered ng ASEAN na regional alliance? Okay, so baka kailangang linawin pa yung bahaging yun for lay people na hindi naman political scientists. But this is like bahagi nung kailangang maintindihan kung ang pag-uusapan ay yung South China Sea claims, especially with a larger country like China. Okay, tapos this one, meron akong nakita sa page 136 na medyo history. Okay, it says relations between the Philippines and Vietnam started many centuries ago. Nakalagay na evidences show that inhabitants of both countries are already engaged in maritime trade prior to the coming of the Europeans. Now, I teach pre-colonial Southeast Asian history at wala pa akong nakitang ebidensya nito. No? Actually, there's no direct trade between the Philippines and Vietnam. Okay, very surprising, lalo na katapat lang natin yung bansa. Pero we never had this engagement with Vietnam. So I think you should recheck your source. Kasi wala pa akong nakitang source nito. Hindi ko alam kung nasa bagong literature to, no? Baka meron na. Pero please recheck your source. Because there is no evidence of direct trade between the two countries in pre-colonial times. Baka earliest is European period na, no? Or 19th century at least. Pero kailangang i-check. Okay, tapos another question I have is yung comprehensive partnership na palagay ko ay hindi na ipaliwanag mabuti. It was never explained nor discussed. So in what ways, aspects, and areas were the Australia-Philippines partnership comprehensive? Parang tinitingnan ko naman yung table, parang pareho lang naman yung sinasabi doon sa Vietnam and Japan. So bakit kailangan nitong very specific nomenclature na ito ay comprehensive as yung iba strategic lang? Yung strategic medyo naipaliwanag, pero yung comprehensive I never found it explicitly discussed in the paper. Okay, tapos isa pang historical note sa page 167 ng paper, nakalagay, from Tokyo's perspective, a powerful foreign country ruling the Philippine Islands as a colony would be detrimental to Japan's national security. Medyo napag-isip ako nito. Tapos, ang alam ko kasi, by the mid-19th century, the Europeans were all over China, including Britain and Hong Kong. So I doubt kung yung Philippines ay nasa radar ng Japan at this period. Pero pa-check na rin kung merong ganitong ugnayan o talagang na-threaten ang Japan kasi may foreign power yung may foreign power na nasa Pilipinas. And babanggitin ko na rin na at this time, pabagsak na yung Spain, so hindi na siya masyadong threat nung panahon ng Meiji period sa Japan. Okay, tapos nag-i-exist pa ba itong strategic partnerships na ito? Medyo nabitin ako dun sa ano, no? Although hindi nakalagay sa paper na hindi pasok yung evaluation, medyo nabitin ako kasi ano nangyari? Pinagpatuloy ba ito ni Duterte? Ino-honor ba niya itong mga strategic partnerships? I think kailangang lagyan ng some sort of short epilogue para lang makita yung kung ano na yung nangyari at saka saan magte-take off yung Duterte administration. Okay, dito sa bahaging ito. Kasi parang bitin eh. Parang ano nangyari pagkatapos. Tapos iba na yung nakikita mo ngayon. Okay, tapos doon naman sa isa pang tanong, ito naman ay yung tungkol sa pag-conceal ng identity ng 3 informants. I don't think this was explained kasi sa history, may dahilan kung bakit kino-conceal yung identity. Parang wala naman akong nabasang controversial dito sa papel na ito para i-conceal yung identity ng tatlong in-interview. Pwede bang malaman kung bakit naka-conceal yung identity ng ano? This doesn't look controversial to me. Kasi mukha naka-spell out naman dun sa mga agreements, ano? So baka kailangan ipaliwanag o hindi ko alam. Kasi sa defense, kahit na-concealed yung identity ng mga informant, sa defense, pinipresent sila. Ina-identify. Pero sa paper, may label lang sila, number 1, number 2, or X, Y, and so on. Okay, tapos pinapaliwanag kung bakit kailangan i-conceal yung identity. So, hindi ko alam kung ano nangyari dito. Okay, tapos yung may annexes na kasama doon sa pinadala na package, hindi ko hindi ko alam kung anong ginagawa sa Polsci, pero sa history kasi, para ilagay mo siyang annex, naka-refer siya doon sa text. So, si Annex A, si Annex B, pero parang wala namang nakalagay na ano, no? Parang ano lang siya, for your information. Okay? Pag naglagay ka ng annex, kailangan naka-refer siya dun sa text para dun mo na lang titingnan yung mahabang ano. So baka kailangang ayusin pa tong bahaging ito. Tapos yung panghuli, yung last note ko, hindi ko alam kung ginagawa sa Polsci, pero hindi ba talaga ina-append yung transcript ng interviews? And how do you know? Hindi ko kaalam kung aling bahagi rito yung ano, no, yung interview. Parang hindi naman siya material masyado doon sa pagbuo ng thesis. So usually, well, sa history, kinakabit namin yung transcript ng interviews para makita kung ano yung contribution nitong mga in-interview doon sa pagbuo ng teorya or pagsagot ng kailangang information on the thesis. Okay? So, hindi ko alam kung paano ayusin. You have to just check with your advisor for that. Okay? So, yun lamang po. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat, Professor Bolinao. Medyo madami na yon, Mico. Hindi ko na alam kung ano pa idadagdag ko doon sa mga pinagsasabi nila, no?
Sorry.
But actually, ang sa akin, there are 2 points, no, na pwede ko pang idagdag siguro doon sa nasabi nila because they what Professors Tana and Bolinao have actually told you are very specific items within the thesis that needs to be addressed, no? Ako ang idadagdag ko lang dito, no? It's more of and it reinforces what Professor Tana was saying earlier on. You chose 2 to amalgamate two theories, no? Yung kay Michael magkamit about yung small state ano niya, at saka yung kay Wilkins about kay Wilkins on strategic partnerships, no? In your establishment of yung comparative matrix mo as far as the different kinds of strategic partnerships are concerned, you were able to explain clearly kung saan pumapasok yung kay Wilkins doon sa ano na yon, no? But I think medyo hindi masyadong klaro yung pasok noong small state doon, no? In terms of trying to compare across, no? And I think this goes back to yung isang punto na sinabi ni Professor Bolinao tungkol doon sa nabitin siya, no? Kasi I think since ang case mo dito is the Philippines, right? Yun yung ano mo, it's the case of the Philippines making choices as to entering into strategic partnerships with certain countries, right? Yun yung pinaka natin dito. If I'm going to try to draw up the picture of what you're actually trying to say, no, it's like saying that the Philippines is faced with a strategic environment, no, that is dominated by the relationship between the United States and China, no, and because of that, nagre-respond ang Pilipinas doon, and ang response niya is to enter into strategic partnerships with certain countries in the region, right? Parang ganun yung nangyari. So in which case, yung binanggit ni Professor Bolinao kanya nabitin siya about where does this or how is this picture now affected by the entry of Duterte, no, into that, ano. In other words, parang yung discussion mo, no, is really a classic IR representation in the sense that even small states look at their foreign relations, no, in purely foreign relations terms, meaning to say na parang ang ano dito is that it's the environment, it's the strategic environment that informs, no, the choices being made by the Philippines. In which case, if that's the argument, then there should be no difference between the Aquino administration, no, and the Duterte administration, right? Parang ganon yung isang ano doon. Your argument would in fact be stronger, no, kung sakaling mapapakita mo na nung pumasok yung Duterte administration, hindi nagkaroon ng pagbabago, no, doon sa kung yung pursuit natin nung strategic partnerships na yon, no. Kaya I think importante yung sinasabi ni Professor Bolinao na baka mamaya kailangan mong maglagay ng kung hindi data yung Duterte administration, no, yung foreign policy ng Duterte administration, it might be important for you to show that, no, that even during because the strategic environment within which nag-operate yung Aquino administration, no, is continuing on until the Duterte administration. Hindi nagbago yung Duterte administration's approach as far as strategic partnerships are concerned. Then that reinforces the argument that you're actually making, no. So baka importante na mapakita mo nga na ganon yung punto, no, na even if you're not going to include the Duterte administration in your in the body of the thesis itself, an epilogue might actually show, no, yung importante yun kasi yun yung basic argument mo, di ba, na parang ang ano dito is it's the strategic environment that shapes itong which brings me to a few points, no, na parang if that's the case, no, then what is the value of arguing small states, no? Kasi parang the point I'm making is this. Ang impression ko kung ganon, there's no difference between the calculations, parang Waltzian yung nagiging argument. There's no difference between the calculations made by small states and the major powers when it comes to the strategic environment, right? Parang ang nagkakaroon ng pagkaiba is how they actually respond to it, right? That as small states with major vulnerabilities, no, mas gusto nilang magkaroon ng kakampi, no, whereas major powers actually do things unilaterally, no, on their own. They strengthen their militaries, no, they pursue their own interests without pero as small states parang so kumbaga the difference seems to be in the mode of how you approach the situation. Parang ganon yung ano. And is that the case? I guess that's the question, di ba? Parang ang ano kasi dito is that is the difference between the calculations made by small states and major powers actually the same? The difference lies only in the mode by which they can actually respond, or the limitations imposed by their weakness or their smallness, no, with which they can actually make choices, no, as to how to approach the situation. Kasi doon sa definition ni Michael magkamit ng small states, pinapakita doon na meron certain characteristics ng small states na wala sa mga malalaking states as far as how they approach, like their uncertainties, the vulnerabilities, etc. Right? So parang ang ano ngayon doon is that if that's the case, no, yung point na yon, hindi ba importante ngayon na ipakita mo na dahil doon, no, may pagkakaiba ang calculations ng small states with big states, right? And in which case, I think the point I'm making here is baka importante natin i-consider doon sa ano, hindi importante, pero hindi pwede na iwan natin na butas yung discussion about, say, domestic politics. No, parang I don't want you to go into domestic politics kasi that's a whole different discussion altogether. Pero kaya importante para sa akin yung discussion na nagbago ba yung across administrations, nagkaroon ba ng pagbabago in terms of the appreciation and therefore the appreciation for the strategic environment and therefore the approach that was being taken as far as strategic partnerships are actually concerned, no? Which is really more of the big picture in doon sa ano, parang kailangan makonekta mo nga yung argument mo doon sa your attempt to actually amalgamate these two approaches, right? Na parang ang ano mo ay small states have these kinds of calculus, therefore strategic partnerships, right? Parang ganun yung ano doon, no? And I think that goes back to what Professor Tana was actually saying. Ano ba talaga yung argument mo? Kailangan makita natin yung ano na yon, no? So para sa akin, it's just tightening, no, from the macro level, theoretical conceptual level, no, doon papunta doon sa mga cases na pinakita mo, no. And I think part nung anong yon, part nung tightening na yon is actually the question of, and I think this brought up by Professor Bolinao earlier as well, no. Parang bakit itong tatlong cases na ito, no, parang Vietnam, Australia, Japan, is it because these are the only cases of strategic partnerships that we actually entered into, no? Which is okay, fine, yun yung pinaka ano natin. But then baka mamaya isang question ngayon na andito is to tighten the rationale as to why these are the countries that we actually entered into a strategic partnership with, no? Parang andon eh. I think what Professor Tana and Professor Bolina were actually saying is you might actually have the points, no, as far as these issues are actually concerned, no, kaya lang you treat them very cavalierly, no, parang it seems obvious. Kailangan paanuhin mo ng konti, lalo na from a theoretical conceptual standpoint, right? So parang it's not just a question of saying na ito yung situation, kaya ganito yung naging response. Treat it, no, theoretically and conceptually. Parang how does this actually reinforce your choice of the theory and the concept, right? Yun yung pinaka ano doon. How does your taking in of the vulnerabilities, no, or the discrete kinds of issues, no, that small states actually have, how does that reinforce the choice, no, of a strategic partnership, di ba? Parang ganun yung yung kailangan na maging ano doon, which will help you in terms of yung point niya, no, ni Professor Bolinaw about, well, parang ano ba yung bago dito or ano ba yung naiiba dito sa yung sinasabi dito kumpara sa sinasabi ng iba using another, no, yung sinasabi nga ni Professor Tana, using another theory, for instance, right? Parang ang gusto mong i-emphasize dito are the choices made by small states, right? And the unique the unique conditions that they face as small states, right? And why then these are the kinds of choices that are actually open to them. Diba? Yun yung conceptual connections na kailangan natin i-tighten in that particular context, no? And I think tightening that goes some ways not to actually answering some of the points that sinabi ni na Professor Tana at ni Professor Borinao. No. So I'll stop there kasi nga parang I think I'll just be reinforcing kung ano yung sinabi na Professor Tana at Professor Borinao with other comments. But since you already have them, then I don't think that there's any need for me to actually repeat, not to be redundant about those particular points. So having said those things, no, Mico, would you like to actually respond, no? Beyond telling us that yes, you will change your thesis, no? Ano ba yung mga ibang you might actually have some direct responses to some of the comments that we actually have made, no? So so I'd like to invite you right now to actually tell us your thoughts, no, regarding these points that have actually been made by the members of the panel. Mico?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Yes, sir. I took note of the comments, and please allow me to respond to some of them. Regarding the choice of the theory, I actually consider really the neoclassical realist framework, but my fear was that given the short period of time, and since NCR captures also the domestic political factors, which I think is very important. Also, I'm not dismissing it. I'm just saying that I may not able to give justice to it in using that framework. So I chose a theory that specifically tailored for small states, because the neoclassical realist, if I'm not mistaken, can likewise be applied to major powers as well. So there, and yes, the small state, small power can interchangeably. I understand that while there may indeed be different, but it appears that in the literature they're being used very loosely and interchangeably. And yes, for the justification of the theory, I think the link, that what would link them is that it both comes from from the realist tradition, if you will. So I think that links the two frameworks. On the variables, of course, I'm looking at the strategic environment, and and of course the results would be the security partnerships that we have on. Okay. Yes, regarding Dr. Bulinao's question, I think yes, these are valid questions on what are its advantages, no, from for the perspective of the major powers. But given the research questions, I'm trying to looking at it from the perspective of the other side of the small powers, because the literature has thus far focused mainly on how the major powers view it, no? So I tried to view it from the other side, but but of course these are very valid concerns on how the other side saw it, no? And yes, on the issue of why do we have a strategic partnership with Vietnam, since we are already we are already members of ASEAN. I think one of the main arguments for this is that it doesn't mean that we are members of ASEAN. It does not mean that we are precluded from having a special relations with each of the members. No, so in this case, we forge a strategic partnership with Vietnam, and as I think I pointed out in the first chapter, among ASEAN member states themselves, they have also, I think, Indonesia and Vietnam, Singapore and Vietnam, and a whole other sets. No, so it does not necessarily mean that we are members of ASEAN. We are precluded already from member of having having this kind of relationship with them. If anything, I think an argument could be made that having a strategic partnership with a fellow ASEAN member state could somehow reinforce or become a platform for cooperating on certain initiatives in ASEAN. For example, currently, this is now speaking on the current administration. The Philippines is the country coordinator for ASEAN-China relations, and Vietnam is the current chair of ASEAN. So I think an argument could be made that since we are strategic partners with Vietnam, we could leverage our positions currently within ASEAN in order to coordinate our certain initiatives, like for example, in the drafting of the Code of Conduct, in the initiatives of the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. So there, and yes, I took note, ma'am, of the pre-colonial history, and yes, I also took note the need, not what Professor Kraft and Professor Bulinaw pointed out, the need to have an epilogue to see if the theory would still stand even in the change of administration in the Philippines. And yes, regarding, ma'am, the interviews, I think the people from DFA and NSC specifically asked me to not name them, so I honored that. They asked me not to name them, and one of them even asked me not to record the conversation. So I respected their decision, and I just simply took notes, but I did not record, perhaps because of the sensitivity of the positions that they are currently holding. They would not want to complicate that with a thesis from a UP student. So yes, on the annexes, I think my error in this regard is not to cite them, but I did use heavily the annexes in the actual text now. But yes, ma'am, I'll just include C annex like this. Okay. Yes. Regarding Professor Kraft's comment, as I've noted, the need for an epilogue to show continuity, and yes, I think this is a very interesting point. The difference in the calculus of a major power and small power, because I think from what the existing literature points out, from a perspective of a major power, it views a strategic partnership as a mechanism for power projection, mainly. I think from a small state, it does not view it that way. Because, as I've mentioned, because of the vulnerabilities that we face, it's more of what we can get than less of what we can offer. From the perspective of a major power, strategic partnership is a tool, essentially, for the balance of power and particularly projecting power. Like, for example, I think a good example would be the Singapore-US strategic partnership. No, I think from the Americans' perspective, it is an alternative, if you will, given we have the Philippine Senate voted to end the presence of U.S. bases. From the perspective of the U.S., it's a power projection mechanisms with the Singaporeans. But from the perspective of the Singaporeans, it is different. It is more of not a power projection, because they just go to the US for simply of exercises, but from the perspective of the Singaporeans, is more to balance China. Yeah. So there, yes, I took note really of the other comments, sirs, ma'am.
Members of the panel, are there any follow-up comments, questions? No, Professor Tana, please.
Yeah. So if the argument is just that, I mean, if you don't want to look at the domestic level variables, and if you just want to look at the structural level factors that would affect behavior, so what makes the theory that you use so different from structural realism? Parang kasi if the Philippines is just responding to external pressures, and that's the reason why they're forming strategic partnerships is because of external threats, the changing security environment, then that makes the small states reactive, right? So where's the agency in that? And then possibly one reason, one solution for you to explain your question of what's the difference between small states and great powers is that if you look at domestic level factors like, you know, foreign policy executives in the Philippines, how do they think, what compels them, what kind of role conceptions do they have, what kind of domestic contestations do they face, and that makes it different. Na hindi lang naman it's because of the structural factors, na hindi lang they're responding to the threat from China, right? And then regarding the interview, there's a way actually, even if they don't want to be named, you can still cite them, like personal communication and the date, and then you can just say from this official, DFA official. You don't have to name them. But yeah, as Professor Bolinao said, it's important that you cite them. I mean, you made an effort, right? You reached out to these people, you made time. So you have to use the data that you gathered. So yeah, I think it's also important yung point ni Professor Bolinao kanina. What are the implications for the great powers?
Okay. Yes, Professor Rugay?
Yeah.
Nakamute ka.
Thank you to Ma'am Lu, Tay, and Sir Herman for the comments. I just want to give like the background kasi I know that both of you, si Professor Bolinao and Dr. Bolinao and Dr. Tana were not present during the proposal defense, and in fact, the original member of the panel is the late Professor Eileen Baviera, who was part of the proposal defense. And in fact, I would know that she would love to hear the presentation of Mico as well as chip in, and I think she would have really sharp comments as well. No, so but I think Dr. Tana did a terrific job of pointing out the limitations of the thesis. Just to give a background, the proposal that Mico defended had 8, if not tama ba ako Mico, 7 or 8 iterations.
Yes.
And it really started atheoretical. No? And I think it has something to do with Mico's particular search. He was trying to look for the perfect theory. He was trying to say, sir, walang theory on small states eh. And then so in his search, wala siyang nakita, then he tried to see what is available. No? So I think when we're saying, ano ba yung contribution ng thesis na to? It's to really see that these grand theories of IR have not really paid attention to states that are not just simply small, but have been the grass, sabi nga dun sa African proverb, no? the vulnerable. No? And I think yung vulnerability na yon, pwede nating sabihin, vulnerable naman talaga ang Pilipinas noon pa. Kaya nga 3 ang nanakop, yung geographical position niya makes it highly prized by major powers. But something happened, and I think, kaya nga gusto ko sabihin kay Mico noon, na kahit Aquino administration lang yung tinitignan mo, there was a major shift, I think. So, hindi enough yung external eh. These are processed also, even by the same people. No? Yeah. So, ang counterfactual niya nga siguro nito is, if Mico asked the questions to SND before and after Scarborough Show, would he have given the same responses? Because remember, the Aquino administration was not anti-China at the get-go. Diba? Hindi, nag-boycott din yung ambassador natin dun sa Nobel laureate ceremony. Pinoy went to China, went to Guangzhou to pay respect to his ancestors. So ang ano dito is something happened. No, so it's not just tama si Dr. Tana eh. Hindi, may agency. And I think that is something that the thesis could contribute to. No, the strategic environment is not simply absorbed; it's also processed by the way of certain developments that have happened in the past. So siguro ito yung sa akin major limitation or flaw, you might say, nung thesis. Hindi niya na trace yung evolution nung Aquino administration foreign policy and security policy determination, no? And therefore I think one major way that the thesis could also move forward is part din ng epilogue na yon is yes, the Duterte administration might be sleeping on this strategic partnership, but it is more than very excited in striking different kinds of partnerships with other allies. So we've heard news of partnerships with Russia, with Israel, with China, and sa part ako naman dun din ako nabitin. So in a way, a small state will continue to engage in such behavior. Ang malaking difference lang is tama yung the choice, but also the way that they ano yung mga impetus, bakit biglang naging urgent yung pag-sign, no? So Mico, you need to capture that, but biglaan when supposedly parang dapat yan evolutionary process so getting to know you, diba? The Japan and Dr. Tana would know this particularly well, diba? Nagsimula sa Japan and then build on and on, no? Such ang naging replacement nun on the part of Vietnam might be the ASEAN process itself, no? So hindi na kailangan na mas bilateral, and doon din ako nakukulangan sa thesis. Kaya nga gusto ko, sabi ko kay Mico, i-matrix mo because the outcome might be the same, but the processes are all different. And sa akin, Vietnam is also a small state pa, no? By I don't know, that might be contested to some, pero I think ang consensus dito. But the two others are middle to major powers. So meron din maaring diferensya. But I mean, si Mico, sinabi niya na, sir, kasi nung sa consultations namin nung unang panahon pa, proposal pa lang, sir, kasi nga it's a reaction to China. So sabi ko, yes, that might sound the obvious reason, but it cannot be that brazen kaagad in a thesis. There must be a way for it to be argued. And in a way, then the Aquino administration's assessment of China is the thing that changed. It's not really the external environment. So, dun lang po sa Ma'am Lu, tama po kayo, no? We need to, alam niyo naman po ang mga policy, lalo na yung mga IR, we play fast and loose with history. With the exception of Sir Herman, kasi history trained yan eh. But some of us, if not most of us in IR, who does a little of IR, si Dr. Tana, IR talaga ako, salingkit. We need to be, siguro ito yung lesson, no? We need to be more diligent, no? In invoking historical details. So Mico, kung walang kung yan ang nag-claim niyan IR, may grain of salt dapat yan ipa-fact check, no? Unless historian talaga yan at historian yung sources, then dapat parating may doubt on the sources. Doon lang po sa annex, Mico, kasi may pagkakaibang annex at appendix.
Okay.
Yung appendix pwede mong hindi banggitin, no? At in fact, yung interview transcripts, kunyari sa MA thesis ko, appendix siya. Kumbaga, hindi naman talaga siya necessary, no? But if you are just curious, no? So, siguro dun sa hindi ko lang din napansin kasi siguro magkalapit sila appendix, annex. Kailangan magkaroon ka ng differentiation which of them is which. Some might be annexes, some might be appendices. So kung critical sa thesis, annex. Kung importante siya, meaning hindi maintindihan ng reader yung thesis without it. Pero kung hindi siya necessary but could enrich or could supplement, no, then it's an appendix. So I think some of your annexes are appendices, but if they are indeed annexes, then they have to be mentioned. No? Sige sir, yun lang po. But I think Mico's thesis has evolved from really a thesis na mas policy-oriented. No? Nasabi ko, hindi ka naman estudyante sa institusyon mo. No? Kung NDCP student ka, baka pwedeng makapasa to, pero hindi eh. No? Estudyante ka ng Department of Political Science and may disciplinal rigors na ini-impose sa'yo. So we will take that into account in the revisions, but I think Mico has been shown how an empirically rich thesis, sa akin kasi empirically rich siya, is insufficient. No? At the end, the empirics must be backed up with a framework and with a kaya nga, if you notice, parang may dinagdag si Mico dyan na huli, yung rival theories and rival explanations. Pinadagdag ko yon kasi sabi ko, pag hindi mo nilagay yan, tatanungin ka. So I think kailangan pang dagdagan, kailangan pang ano yon, and in fact baka kailangan ilagay din sa simula so that the reader will know na the student knew about all the other rival explanations, knew all about what other theories might offer as an explanation, but kumaga hindi lang niya masyado na sa boksingan ng teorya, yung manok niya hindi masyado niyang na set up to a good fight with the others. Kaya nabubugbog, no? And kaya sabi ni Dr. Tana, the role of domestic politics. Ako nga, pati yung Vietnam and the Philippines have territorial disputes. Yeah, that they are willing to, kumbaga, sweep under the rug, no? Unlike yung Australia and Japan is fine, no? But kaya nga yung Philippines and Japan yung pinaka-interesting sa akin eh. So you're talking about two small states, para lang talaga siyang it's more talagang nag-balance, no? But you have two small states balancing supposedly against a very big state, no? At sa akin importante din yung historical relations. Sabi ni Dr. Lubolina, yung sa Vietnam hindi ganun ka thick yung relations. But if we're talking about Japan, for example, Japan and Philippines naman yung talaga. So kung may variation na ganun, then you might argue na then it doesn't count as the explanation. If they vary in terms of the thickness and the long shadow of experience with one another, if that vary, then according to the philosophy of social science, we can count that as the explanation kasi the phenomenon is similar. It resulted in strategic partnerships. So hindi lang din na lumitaw, no? Kasi sa disiplina natin, Mico, the best way for you to defend your theory is you use the other theories and you make the argument that it doesn't work. No? You just don't ignore it. No? You have to say na, okay, I've considered theory B, theory C, pero hindi siya nagfi-fit. And this is where your empirics come from. No? So sa tingin ko yun yung kailangan mas paigtingin, and sabi ko kay Mico, parang nakalimutan mo yung theories of IR. No? Nakalimutan mo yung clashing, yung battle, no, in the arena. Kasi dapat yan sa simula at dun sa dulo. Sige sir, yun lang po. Marami pong salamat ulit.
Thank you, Aris. Professor Bolinao, yes.
Yeah, actually maikling comment lang tapos kasi bigla akong naisip ito doon sa comment mo, Herman, na yung pag-gravitate ba natin sa China under the Duterte administration, at ito na yung sa epilogue na sinasabi ko, no? Ito ba ay bahagi ng some sort of strategic partnership? Or do we have a strategic partnership with China now? Kasi kung nag-gravitate na tayo doon sa threat, ano pa yung silbi ng ibang strategic partnership natin? So baka kailangan ding i-factor in yun. Kasi siguro kaya ako nabitin doon sa pagbabasa ng ano, kasi parang hindi na ito yung realidad ngayon. Okay? So baka kailangan yun yung pambridge doon sa scenario na yun. Okay? Yun lang po.
Okay. Maraming salamat po, Professor Bolinao. So, Mico, nakuha mo na lahat yung ano. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Not so much in your defense, but meron ka pa bang gustong idagdag as far as yung ano to this conversation?
Siguro, sir, just would like to thank everyone. Given our own personal difficulties, this request was accommodated. So, yun lang po, ma'am, sirs, maraming salamat po.
Okay, thank you, Mico. So I guess we will be asking Mico to leave the meeting while we deliberate on what the final decision is as far as your thesis is concerned. So, Ari, sorry. Bago ano.
Bilang host po ng meeting, gusto ko lang din po magpasalamat dun sa mga nanood ng stream. Medyo marami-rami, medyo trending tayo. May nakita ko up to 30 were watching it. Opo. So, maraming pong salamat. Pero unfortunately, baka hindi na po namin i-broadcast yung mangyayari, i-stream from this point. But we will just inform siguro sa department if what the outcome of the defense is. So, maraming pong salamat. So, Mico, I will message you again and para bumalik ka, but the panel needs to deliberate.
Thank you, sir, ma'am.
So, Mico, we need to invite you to leave the meeting at this point in time.